Welcome everyone. Folks are still signing in right now. We'll wait one more minute. Okay, I think we will get started now. We only have an hour, so we want to make the most of that. And so at this point, I'll just kick us off. So welcome and thank you for everyone that's joining to talk about the draft Clark Street Crossroads corridor study. So my name is Catherine Hurd, and I am the lead planner for the North Region here at the Chicago Department for Planning and Development. And then with me are my colleagues, Danielle Kreider, who is also a North Region planner, Cindy Rubik, who's the Deputy Commissioner overseeing North, Northwest, and the Central Planning regions. You'll also see our leader, Commissioner Maurice Cox, very soon, but I should also recognize the work of my former North Region colleagues, Michael Berkshire and Paul Reese, who are no longer with the city, but played really key roles in leading this process. So let's get started. Today's meeting is really just a brief presentation to provide an overview of the work that's been done over the last year plus, and talk about what you can expect in the study's draft report, which is already online at clarkstreetcrossroads.com. Importantly, we'll also talk about how the document can be used and what the next steps look like for the recommendations. And at the end, we'll do a brief Q&A and talk about the best ways to provide feedback before this report is finalized. So the Q&A box is available for all participants. If you have questions, please enter those in at any point. We will look at those all at the end in the last 15 minutes, or hopefully a little bit more, and answer as many as we can. And if we can't get to all of them, we can release an FAQ, frequently asked questions, following the meeting. So the first 15 minutes, we're going to do a quick welcome and introductions. So Commissioner Maurice Cox will give a little bit of an overview, followed by some statements by Alderman Kappelman and Alderman Martin. Then I will do about a half-hour presentation of the study overview. And then again, the last 15 minutes, we'll do questions. So again, please do submit those through the Q&A box. So Commissioner Cox, please take it away.
Yes, thank you, Catherine, and good evening, everyone. It's great to be back together this evening. The last time we were together, it was in a really hot gymnasium, and it was the summer of 2020. So it's really great to be near to have a final look at the Clark Street Crossroads study. I want to first thank Alderman Kappelman, Alderman Martin, both of you, for your belief in the power of planning. And this work of bringing people together is a kind of critical first step to laying out a much more intentional future. And I think Crossroads is a great title for this study because Clark Street is at a crossroads. And this study is the first big step forward. I want to thank all of the participants that have shared their insights. This started in 2019, I think, the fall. So you've been at it for a while, and I just appreciate you staying the course with us, as well as the partners who will help implement the study's strategies with an eye towards more equitable, more pedestrian-oriented and viable corridor for many years still to come. So as many of you know, the study included a pretty robust technical analysis and community engagement process that you have been a part of. And that has helped to determine a whole set of opportunities, was able to unearth some restraints that we are working with, and most importantly, has given us a way to prioritize future development. So it's not just a streetscape, it also tries to be a support for small businesses, tries to catalyze new infill development, and has very strong recommendations for programmatic uses. Um, you know, the public realm improvements along the corridor. Was really, really pleased to see you have a robust conversation about protected bike lanes. So there's a lot in this report. Um, for us, this is an example of allowing the community to lead the conversation, to help get everyone aligned. Um, so alignment is really key when you have multiple neighborhoods, multiple wards. Um, it's about getting everyone on the same page about how we move forward. And I would just say that it's a roadmap now. Um, it's a principal thoroughfare for the North Side. It certainly touches thousands of people personally and professionally on a daily basis. So I want to thank the property owners who've stayed the course, developers who've expressed interest in the corridor, our partner agencies, CDOT, and a host of community partners that this Clark Street is blessed with. And our hope is that the study has brought us together, given us a guide for investments that can be laid out incrementally. This is some pretty smart work. It's incredibly pragmatic. It's also incredibly proactive. And so I just want to thank first as well, Catherine Hurd, for stepping in and taking this on when Michael stepped aside, and to all of the members, both new and old, Danielle, Cindy, who are new and have kept this alive and have really helped to deepen the study's impact. So I think the collective efforts that you'll see are extremely well conceived, and it gives me an enormous sense of hope of how strategic we can be in future investments. Clark Street now has a framework, and the framework is set for investment. And so again, thank you. I hope you enjoy the outcomes. It's still going to be up for public comment, but the key is we plan, therefore we implement. We plan first and then we implement. So this is an implementation document, and there'll be some very tangible next steps that we hope you will guide us and help prioritize. And so with that, I'm going to pass it to our retiring Alderman Kappelman. And I hope we can also hear from our continued Alderman Martin. So thank you all.
Thank you, Commissioner Cox. I do believe in the power of planning, and I can't thank Catherine Hurd and her team enough. Their expertise, not only in the Clark Street Crossroads process, but throughout the 46th Ward. I cannot imagine not having a team like that. Not many people know the complexities that occur when there is planning, because there's all these different groups that intersect, and Catherine has to balance all that and her team, and she does it quite well. So I want to thank all of you again for joining us tonight, and for all of your participation and support throughout the Clark Street Crossroads planning process. As we continue to see increased interest an investment along Clark Street from Montrose to Foster. It's important. A thoughtful vision and planning study will allow informed development and zoning enhancements and public realm improvements throughout that entire corridor. I want to thanks to all of your involvement and the great work that the Department of Planning and Development has done. This final study will allow us to promote positive growth and activation along the corridor that celebrates and strengthens a safe, vibrant Clark Street. This plan will allow for a unified and informed strategic vision moving forward, and I'm excited to hear your thoughts on that vision tonight.
Okay. Alderman Martin.
Thanks very much, Commissioner. I have relatively little to add to that. I just want to thank everyone across our community as well as across our various departments. Obviously, you, Commissioner, Catherine, Paul before you, our colleagues at CDOT as well. And then everyone, like I mentioned, from across the community who's taken time over the last number of months to come to a meeting, to provide input in a number of different ways. This near final plan is a reflection of that, and we're so very eager to hear about your feedback to ensure that as we move forward to finalizing this and onto implementation, that it continues to reflect the needs and values of our dynamic Uptown, Ravenswood, and Andersonville communities. So for those of you who are watching this live, participating live, thank you so much. For those of you who are watching after the fact, a big thank you as well, and looking forward to seeing this near final product along with you. Thanks.
You're here. Thank you very much. Let me share my screen again, and we will dive right in. So I'll now walk through a pretty high level overview of the study. So remember, this is a culmination of a process that took a lot of people over a year to complete. So the full summary is in the draft document itself, located at clarkstreetcrossroads.com. The document is highly illustrated, so it's relatively easy to read while still capturing all the primary findings and recommendations. So please do check it out there. As a reminder, we're talking about Clark Street corridor between Montrose at the south and Foster at the north. This corridor is at a confluence of multiple neighborhoods, block clubs, districts, wards. So that's why this map on the left is so busy. On the right, there is an attempt to kind of break that into the different layers. So you can understand why we're calling this Crossroads. The genesis for this study really came out of concerns that there wasn't a cohesive identity or real clear direction to guide the future of this corridor. So being between three very desirable and vibrant neighborhoods, that's Andersonville, Ravenswood, and Uptown, there has been this increasing development pressure with several new projects proposed along the corridor, but not a lot of clear consensus on how to steer or even evaluate that development. So that was one of the purposes of getting started here, is what is this corridor going to be and how are we going to shape that? There's also this desire to learn how to prioritize our resources to make the biggest impact and work better together, all of these different entities, to be able to multiply our efforts and get everyone moving in the same direction. So this is to both better connect the surrounding neighborhoods through this area, as well as reinforcing this corridor's role as a destination in its own right. So 3 goals were developed, refined, and then confirmed through the community process, and they are the following. The first goal is to articulate a unified identity and long-term vision for the corridor, identify appropriate private development uses, density, and urban design guidelines, and finally to define public realm improvements to express the unique corridor character and promote additional comfort and safety for pedestrians and cyclists. So a steering committee was assembled of some of the key entities along the corridor. So this included the aldermen of the wards and their offices overlapping or abutting the corridor, neighborhood groups and block clubs near the corridor, the chambers of commerce and special service area providers, and then a couple other key stakeholders such as the Black Ensemble Theater, which is obviously a key corridor and community institution, as well as CDOT, as we talk about any public realm recommendations. There are four main products that came out of this process. So the first is a summary of the priorities, goals, challenges, and opportunities. So at that point, that's where you zoom out. These are developed through engagement with key stakeholders, analyzed by development and design expert team, the consultant team, and then refined with the larger community. Coming out of that, there were recommendations developed for potential projects, programs, and policy changes. So that was the moment to get creative with the design expert consultants and other project partners to brainstorm the potential strategies and concepts, which were then shared back with the community for feedback and refinement. And then taking those long-term recommendations and really talking it through with the folks who will ultimately be responsible for implementing those to determine the roles, responsibilities, and next steps. And then ultimately, the end product is a roadmap for future decision-making, which is what there is a draft of on the website today, and we will be talking about. So this project began at the end of 2021, and all through 2022, the steering committee advised and discussed the ideas and findings at Key Milestone. There were also quite a bit of engagement opportunities directly with the community through online surveys, focus groups, meetings, workshops. And then here we are at the very beginning of 2023, doing this final presentation before completing the study and hopefully getting it adopted at the Chicago Plan Commission. We are targeting March, which will hopefully give everyone enough time to make any final refinements that may come out of the feedback that we get on the draft document. So now I'll just describe generally what's in the document itself and more importantly, how it'll be used. So there are three main topic areas addressed in the study, and each has their own high-level recommendations and guidelines at a corridor level. And then in a bit, we'll talk about more specific recommendations by segment of the corridor. So the first, again, this is high level for the entire corridor. The first topic is land use and development. And the guiding principle for land use and development is to promote strategic economic development and improve housing affordability to create vibrant and welcoming neighborhoods. And so the high level recommendations around that are to encourage transit-oriented development with a range of housing affordability levels and unit types, especially family-sized units and affordable units, promoting reuse, renovation, and activation of existing historic structures, supporting existing businesses and attracting complementary organizations to the corridor, and supporting building and business owners to encourage beautification and activation of their existing building frontages, programming short-term or temporary activations of sites that are being underutilized, and then finally to promote and incentivize sustainable building practices. So one way that we're doing that is to develop design guidelines. And design guidelines were a very important aspect of this work to help advise property owners and developers about what's expected, and then also to help provide criteria when evaluating development proposals. So the design guidelines provide best practices and examples of good design for a few common types of building projects along the corridor. So those categories are adaptive reuse of historic buildings and storefronts, special consideration for corner lots, longer blocks, and across from large open spaces, new residential mixed use and development, ground floor and storefront activation, and then finally ground floor residential and live work spaces. So these guidelines are already on top of the existing neighborhood design guidelines, which apply to all Chicago neighborhood commercial corridors and are basically a baseline set of urban design guidelines, as well as the zoning ordinance, of course, which includes the pedestrian street design standards. So Clark Street here is a pedestrian street, which means there are some very specific requirements for design, especially along the sidewalk, to promote a safe, comfortable, and vibrant pedestrian experience. The guidance to property owners and developers interested in doing projects along Clark Street is to prioritize redevelopment of vacant or underutilized sites that do not conform to the pedestrian street design standards. Development opportunity sites have been identified along the corridor as a part of this process. Please note that all of them are in the control of private property owners, not the city. And they aren't necessarily sites where anything is currently proposed or being considered, but it's reasonable some of these sites may be redeveloped in the future based on experience on this corridor as well as other similar corridors in the area. So the criteria that are sort of a flag to everyone that we might anticipate development on the sites are that the current use is incompatible with the long-term vision of the area, the current development is incompatible with the long-term vision for the area, or the site is otherwise underutilized. So it's vacant or it's lower density than really makes sense in the context. So again, this is just so we can proactively think about what's needed there rather than simply reacting to a proposal when it comes forward and then starting the discussion from the beginning every single time. So as a thought experiment and proof of concept, 3 of these identified development opportunity sites were pushed a little bit further to test out how the site might be developed if they were following the draft recommendations and guidelines. So this is one of them. This is the northwest corner of Clark and Wilson. It's a large surface parking lot at the corner with a couple of big box commercial buildings. So it was defined as a potential development opportunity site because it's underutilized. It's a big surface parking lot and low density buildings there. It wasn't designed in a way to support what we've since identified through this process as the community's long-term vision for a corridor that's walkable and vibrant. So if this were proposed today, it probably wouldn't be approved. The one on the left, what's already constructed, that would probably not be approved, especially because of the less than positive impact on the pedestrian environment and the fact that this is a pedestrian street. So in this theoretical project concept on the right, the desire was for a mix of uses and more activation along Clark Street. So this is achieved through active and visible ground floor uses along the sidewalk. That's the red color there. With any parking tucked behind the buildings rather than being the dominant thing that you see from the sidewalk. The strategic open spaces is located here with a corner plaza, a courtyard on Wilson, and then also a green belt on the backside of the property to connect to the surrounding neighborhoods. So please do check out the report for more information on this and also the other 2 theoretical site development concepts. This is just an example. For the next topic, multimodal mobility, the guiding principle is to enhance safe and equitable access to the corridor by increasing transit connectivity and prioritizing the pedestrian experience. So that includes some high-level recommendations for the whole corridor of pursuing additional pedestrian space for improved intersections, curb extensions, mid-block crossings, enhancing bus stops and amenities, clustering different modes and resources together to make more convenient and accessible transfers between modes, refining the curbside uses, so things like street parking, loading, rideshare pickup and drop off, and then space for everything else. Looking at that again and thinking about how that can be used more efficiently. And then finally, to extend the protected bike lanes and improve connections to the Greenway network, which I will talk about now. Bike lanes were a hot topic during this process and emerged as a pretty clear community priority, though there are certainly some concerns that will need to get worked out as this gets sorted. But the study does include some concepts for how protected bike lanes might happen along the corridor. So this will likely involve some reconfiguration of the street's cross-section, including potentially some parking loss, before figuring out exactly how much, where, or what the real configuration will look like. CDOT will need to do technical analysis as well as talk to the local businesses along the corridor to really determine what their operational needs are. And then there will, of course, be community engagement to help inform those decisions. So folks that are interested in this should be sure to participate when that time comes. So keep your ear out about that. The study recommendations for this establish a pretty clear rationale and has built momentum to hopefully be able to secure funding and do the technical analysis, design, and engineering work that needs to be done to ultimately install these bike lanes. And we have a documented set of community support, and the key implementation partners are excited to find a way to make it happen. So there are also similar concepts for intersection treatments to improve pedestrian safety and other improvements to create more space for pedestrians and transit users. Again, please do see the draft report for more information on these if you're interested. And then the final topic after development and mobility is public realm activation. So the guiding principle for public realm activation is to create a cohesive and inviting experience for all ages and abilities with attractive and resilient urban landscapes. So some high-level strategies corridor-wide for that include integrating strategic lighting and public art, installing innovative green infrastructure to promote corridor and neighborhood resilience, encouraging and supporting outdoor dining, utilizing enhanced landscape practices, including improved street health, developing cohesive corridor-wide branding and graphic identity, and establishing and programming new public spaces. So as I mentioned, there's also recommendations specific to different segments of the corridor. So the corridor is divided into 3 different segments because each of these has a distinct character and context. So the North Corridor, which is shown here, includes South Andersonville Commercial District and Historic District. It's a walkable area for shopping and restaurants with smaller local businesses. The blocks are short compared to the rest of the corridor, and the scale is a little bit finer because of the historic buildings and all the storefronts. So the primary goals for this segment are really to enhance the existing character through preservation, adaptive reuse of the historic buildings, and small business support. The mid-corridor section includes the block facing St. Boniface Cemetery and acts as a connector between the north and south corridor destinations. So the street light here suffers a little bit, possibly because there's only development on one side of the street since the cemetery is on the other side. There's not a lot of active uses or destinations here. So this is an area that could really use more people, which means some density in any potential future development projects. And since the cemetery is open on the east side of the street, you can handle some density here because there isn't a risk of creating a canyon effect. On the south corridor, that starts to break down and be a little less cohesive. So the blocks are longer and the types of businesses and uses are more varied. There's a lot of wholesale businesses located along this segment, which operate pretty differently than some of the traditional shops to the north. The Black Ensemble Theater is located here at Sunnyside and Clark. That's obviously a popular destination, community institution. So building onto that success, there are opportunities to reinforce this as a cultural destination by attracting complementary uses and bringing more people to the area. One way to do that is to activate some of the vacant and underutilized sites and storefronts with new development or adaptive reuse of existing historic buildings. So each of the 3 corridor segments has its own specific set of recommendations. As an example, these maps here show opportunities for mobility and public realm improvements for just the North Corridor segment. I won't go through all 3. This is just a sample, so you know what to expect in the report. And these maps help locate the opportunities for certain types of interventions that were described earlier in the high-level recommendations. So these are things like intersection improvements and open space activation. Again, there isn't really time to go through the details of these, so please do see the report for more information, but these provide a roadmap for future projects. So of course, there would need to be outreach and working out all the logistics and funding and everything before these could be implemented. As many of you know, public realm projects typically don't just happen. So a coordinated effort is really necessary between CDOT, local leaders, and community members in order to help elevate projects that really should be prioritized, because there's limited resources and time at the city. And so if we can make that case together, that really helps prioritize those projects. Even better if the projects can serve multiple purposes at once and stretch those resources even further, which we've tried to describe in this report as well. So having this community-driven set of recommendations documented and ultimately adopted at the Chicago Plan Commission, that goes a long way to help make sure that the community's priorities are driving the decisions proactively rather than reactively. And then finally, each corridor segment also has recommendations for development. So on the right side of the slide, there's an excerpt from the report that includes the preferred uses, density, height, zoning districts, and other considerations for this segment. Again, this is just a sample from the North Corridor segment. And then there are also design inspiration photos to provide some visual examples of what is expected for further development in each of those segments. On the left is a map that shows the opportunities for strategies like activating vacant storefronts, preserving historic facades, adaptive reuse of historic structures, and then finally those development opportunity sites that met the criteria that I described earlier as being something we should keep an eye out for because they are likely to be or possibly could be redeveloped, and we want to have some ideas about how those should be redeveloped before that happens. So this is information that can be used by property owners and developers to understand the expectations for projects and also give them some ideas for where to start. This can also be used to evaluate projects to make sure that future development aligns with the long-term vision for this corridor. So that's really the value, is that this is sort of a guide, but then also it's our rubric as we're evaluating projects. So I know I went through that really quickly. And so please do check out the website, clarkstreetcrossroads.com, to review the draft report and also provide feedback through the online survey tool, which I will talk about a little bit here. So this will be open until February 12th. The report has been posted for almost 2 weeks and the survey's been open that time. We do have quite a few responses already, but if you haven't yet responded, please do before February 12th. It can be a really quick survey, or if you really want to take your time and provide a lot of written feedback, that's also available to you. So there are just 8 multiple choice questions that ask your kind of general level of agreement or disagreement by topic. And those topics are community identity and priorities, study objectives, land use and economic development, multimodal mobility, public realm activation, design guidelines, document legibility, and usefulness in the future. Then there are also, if you want to share more detailed feedback with the team, there are free response fields. So they're also divided by topic. We have those divided by topic so we can properly record everyone's thoughts before finalizing the report. This feedback will inform the final refinements before this goes to the Plan Commission in March. So the next steps here, again, the online survey tool closes February 12th, and we're targeting March Plan Commission for final adoption, which is the last stop to making this study official. And again, this planning study is a framework, it's a roadmap, it's a point in time. That does not mean that any of this stops happening. We're already talking about how things are going to move forward and be implemented. That momentum will continue. And so we will rely on you, the community, to help keep the energy level up, keep the enthusiasm up, and keep showing up to support these recommendations. So at this point, we will try our best to answer some of the questions that you've been entering into the Q&A chat box. So feel free to keep those coming. There are a lot in there that I see. I haven't read them yet, but I see that there are a lot. And so we will do our best to get through as many of those as possible. We may not be able to get to everything, and we probably won't know the answers to everything. So we can provide frequently asked questions after the meeting where we can cover some of those commonly asked topics. So let me take a look at what our questions are here.
Catherine, do you want me to start?
Yeah.
Give you a little, you give your voice a tiny little break. We're trying to gather the questions, during the meeting. As you said, we have a lot of them, but we're, kind of grouping them into some consistent themes that we're seeing throughout a lot of these questions, which is great. The first question is, how does this plan promote sustainability, such as by promoting pedestrian experience as well as for bicyclists? I think you answered a lot of that, but if you could just maybe quickly summarize.
And that's fine, because resilience is a key part of this, and it's a really important part of how we would approach any long-term planning in neighborhoods. That's obviously critical. And so for a corridor study in particular, those are going to be strong drivers. And so when we're talking about encouraging more multimodal transportation by making walking more attractive and biking more attractive and comfortable for all ages and abilities, as well as making transit more attractive and easier to use. That's all very important to help, as we call this, a mode shift away from as much reliance on private vehicles. And so that's very important for long-term resiliency, as we're thinking about the long term of this corridor. But then also the fact that this is a corridor that has a lot of existing historic buildings. There are not recommendations to level all the buildings and build a bunch of new buildings. There's embodied carbon in all of those existing buildings, and many of them also have lovely historic features. So there's a lot of emphasis on adaptive reuse and being able to utilize those existing historic buildings or facades or architectural elements to be able to keep that character, but then also not have to redo everything. Improving density by transit-oriented development is another way that really reduces carbon footprint. So having more people living closer together, relying on transit and the bike network and the pedestrian improvements, those are all very helpful if we're talking about the long-term resiliency of our communities.
Great. Okay. And then the next group of questions, we had a lot of questions about the bike lanes, protected bike lanes. Have they been designed? Do they include, a raised elevation? Will they be connected to other bike facilities in the greater neighborhood area? So a lot of questions specific to that item.
Yeah, and they're good questions, and the answer is we don't know yet. So the purpose of this study was to be able to identify the priorities of the community and what is needed to get us moving in the direction that that was articulated through this kind of community-led visioning process. And so protected bike lanes were obviously something that came to the top of the list as being very, very important to this community. There are still a lot of questions that need to be answered associated with that, particularly on talking to the businesses along this corridor and really understanding what they need and are doing and how this all fits together. There'll be technical analysis that needs to happen. There'll be engineering analysis that needs to happen. There'll be design that needs to happen. And that's where those more technical and detailed questions about exactly what's this going to look like, when's it going to happen, how is it going to be paid for, what impacts is it going to have on X number of things, that's when those questions get answered. And so really at this point, we're setting up the community to be able to go after those projects, to elevate those as priority projects. And so that we kind of have a set of guiding principles and a framework so that when we get started on this, we know what's important.
Commissioner, did you want to?
Yeah, I just wanted, I have been following the conversation in the chat as well. And I really appreciate people basically saying, can we go further than what is being shown in the framework And the answer is absolutely yes. But we have already shifted the conversation because protected bike lanes is the starting point, which is not where we were, 12 months ago. So thank you for shifting the conversation and continuing to push. Should we be looking at raised bike lanes that at least perceptually widen the public realm? I think absolutely that should be looked at. And so I think the city, should we be looking at raised cross intersections that are more pronounced than what we've seen? Absolutely, we should look at the technical feasibility of that with our partners at CDOT. So just understand that because you have prioritized bike lanes as a baseline, protected bike lanes as a baseline, and that you want to push Clark Street to be an innovative example of what can be done, that's the conversation that you've engendered. And I think we are happy to explore that together with you in the next phase of the project.
Correct. We have to get through this phase first, though, which
Right.
is getting Plan Commission to adopt the plan, which is helpful in assisting everyone in securing funding and identifying the priorities in this corridor, which is great. The next question is more technical, Catherine. What was the budget for this planning work? And do we have a budget for implementation?
So for this work was funded through the Clark Montrose TIF district. And that was, I think, $250,000. And so in terms of funding for implementation, because this is going to be implemented by many entities, the funding is going to come from many different places. So we don't have, a set of money that is specifically for Clark Street implementation. There are many pots of money that we can pull from to implement these depending on what type of project we're talking about. So right now, our focus, as Cindy said, is to get this adopted at the Plan Commission. That really helps us advocate to say, hey, we have a list of projects. We already know what we want to do. We've talked to the community about these priorities already. We've already vetted some of these ideas with them initially. And so, this is a good project. We're ready to go, let's get some money. And so that really sets us up to be able to do that. But this is also a long-term vision. I want to make sure that's clear. This isn't just going to get all implemented in the next year or two. This is going to happen incrementally over time, particularly on the development side, because the city doesn't control like really any of that property. And so most of the land that we're talking about is privately held, and the city doesn't have ultimate control over what private property owners do or don't do with their property. So we need to think about the long term. We just need to make sure that as we're all marching along this together, we are moving in the same direction. And so this sets us up to be able to do that.
Right. I do think the next question is kind of building off of that. Someone asked, are these recommendations in the plan, are they going to be binding, or will there be flexibility during the implementation process?
Sure. So these are recommendations. They're not, ordinance or directives. So they are sort of a set of criteria that will be used in decision making in the future. And so they've been developed and refined through this community process, and they are a roadmap to identify our priorities, and they'll help us get funding. And that will continue to be refined after the study is adopted, and as we kind of go through all the different implementation processes. It will not be a process, it will be multiple projects that happen on their own process timelines.
That's great. Thanks. Thanks for clarifying. That was a good question. Someone else asked, because there are diagrams showing, potential visions of Clark Street and how it could be reconfigured. Did we consider eliminating parking on both sides of Clark Street? Did we consider indoor parking facilities, which I think those would all be privately owned? Did we consider infrastructure to allow speedier bus travel?
So those are all things that can be discussed. So for starting kind of one at a time, so I think the first one was parking on both sides. So in order to fit protected bike lanes, I don't think that's probably strictly necessary. Maybe it is, but so that wasn't something that was necessarily proposed as a recommendation here. But it certainly could be part of the discussion when figuring out what that actual design is going to look like. For, I think, indoor parking facilities, again, we don't own any of the land here, so all the property is of, the individual lots are privately owned. So the city doesn't have any land to put, parking structures on here. And then the bus question. So having bus boarding islands and providing more space for people that are using the bus. Those are things that are really helpful to make it easier and faster for people to get on and off the bus. And then also encourage more people to use the bus so that the bus can, move through a little bit easier and hopefully relieve some of the vehicular congestion here. So figuring out exactly what that looks like, again, the engineering still needs to be worked out. And, the technical analysis of, is that going to speed up the bus? How much would that speed up the bus? That's not something that's in the scope of this, but that can be looked at in the future.
Okay, the next question, I'll answer it. Have we confirmed that there's sewer and other types of capacity for higher density on this corridor? And this is another good question. We get this question a lot in other parts of the city as well that are growing, like the Fulton Market area, formerly industrial area, and now we're seeing a lot of growth in that corridor as well. And really the sewer and utility analysis and any upgrades that are needed for private development, that's done during the city's permitting review process through the Office of Underground, the OUC. And they do it fairly early in the permit process as well. Developers can even ask for that review even before they submit for permit early as they're doing their design. And so all that utility upgrading or improvement is really figured out at that process, because it's dependent on the number of units, dependent if it's office use or residential use, all those things have to be designed specific for the building. Okay, the question was, how was this corridor and this study area specifically selected?
Yeah, so I talked about this at the very beginning, but basically there was a specific problem that was trying to be solved here. And that was that this is at this, crossroads of all these different neighborhoods. It was sort of at the edge of these different neighborhoods and overlapped with all these other districts. And so there really wasn't a clear identity for what this corridor is. And so it wasn't doing a great job connecting to the other neighborhoods, but it also wasn't really a place in and of itself. And so the purpose of the study was to help figure out what's the direction, what's the vision, particularly when there's all this development coming in. How do we evaluate that? How are we advising developers that want to do a project? What types of sites, what types of projects? And then if they are proposing a project, how do we review that project so that it makes sense in this specific context? So that was really the genesis of this. And then also this is in a tax increment financing district, a TIF district, as I mentioned previously. And so that limits the actual geographical area that you can study. And so that was sort of decided for us, because if you use the TIF money to do a project, it has to be inclusive and not anything more outside of the TIF district boundaries.
Great. I'll answer this next question. Does this plan include any temporary or permanent street closures for greater pedestrian use? For temporary street closures, that anywhere in the city, that can be requested through a special events review process through the Department of Cultural Affairs and Special Events, as well as CDOT reviews those as well. And, we see those for festivals that happen on the weekend. That's something that is done quite frequently in Chicago, which is great. In terms of permanent street closure, we looked at pedestrian improvements, we're in terms of the study's recommendations, including curb extensions, intersection improvements, gateway markers, paving improvements, but not a permanent closure of the streets. And then someone asked a question of what does a pedestrian street mean? Catherine, do you want to tackle that? Because you've
Sure.
had a lot of discussions.
Yes. So a pedestrian street, that's a zoning overlay. And so that's in the zoning code in Chicago. And so there are certain requirements that are associated if a property is located on a pedestrian street in the zoning map. And so that includes requirements for the design of facades. So there needs to be a certain amount of transparency of the facades. The site plans need to be oriented so that the buildings are facing the street. So when we looked at that Staples and Walgreens site, that would not comply because it's parking that's against the street and the buildings are set back. Also, strip malls are an example of something that are less than ideal and would not be required on a pedestrian street. And so the purpose of them is to have, an active ground floor to eliminate conflicts or reduce conflicts with pedestrians and vehicles, tuck parking behind so it's not visible from the sidewalk, things like that. We don't want to see drive-throughs and things where that would negatively impact the pedestrian environment.
Another question, are there current proposals at the development scenario sites?
So at one of them, at Clark and Leland, there is a proposal that's being reviewed now. I don't know if Alderman Kappelman or Kylie want to comment on that at all.
What's that project again?
At Clark and Leland.
Clark and Leland?
Is it 4701?
Yes. I told residents that I will be making a formal announcement and that will come out Thursday in our newsletter. But basically there was a lot of interaction, great interaction from a lot of different people involved. Uptown United and the Clark Street Block Club both provided letters of support for it, which helped guide me in making a decision. Ultimately, I felt like it was the best use to get rid of that parking lot. I know Commissioner Cox and I feel the same about parking lots, and the development will be approved. So then it goes before zoning, and then it goes before the city council.
Yes. So, and that site was identified before we had a proposal, I think, for the. So when we identified it as part of the study as an opportunity site, that preceded, all this figuring out what an actual proposal is going to look like here. So
right. The big win on this is that there'll be retail on the first floor.
Okay.
So it'll be more activated. Before they were insisting on ground floor apartments.
So we're hoping that as a part of those discussions with the community and the developer, that some of these design guidelines that we've been discussing as part of this process inform that. Of course, as the architect and developer were developing plans, this study wasn't out yet, but I know that we did share some feedback with them preliminarily throughout.
Okay, thank you, Alderman Kappelman, for responding to that. The next question, could the Clark frontage of the cemetery be reconfigured to make it feel more like a public open space or as part of the pedestrian experience?
So cemeteries are, and this one in particular, are not publicly owned. So the city doesn't have control over that. So the private owner of the cemetery would have to decide what they want to do with their property. If they want to talk to us about it, we'd love to.
Okay, and then I think we have just a few more. What public process will there be for creating localized branding, promoting, selecting public art, and other placemaking efforts?
So so that is going to be determined through kind of future conversations, particularly with the chambers of commerce and the special service area providers. They already have programs for, you know, public art and other placemaking programs. And so really the purpose of the study was to kind of help steer that and help them be able to get a better grasp of what each other are doing so they can work together. So one of the recommendations in the study is for a coordinated effort between those groups to look at um, you know, branding and placemaking and public art, but TBD on that one.
Great. And then the question about the Clark Montrose TIF. The question was, you know, can this TIF be dissolved and what happens to the unused TIF money, you know, once at the end of the year, I guess?
So the TIF is set to expire at the end of this year. So unless there's some kind of legal action, that's what is set to happen. My understanding is that the money that's in the TIF then goes back to the taxing bodies. Is that right, Cindy?
I believe that's correct.
And I would, I just would add that, you know, a TIF allocation assumes that there are projects that need a public incentive to happen. If you don't have a plan, if you don't have a roadmap, you have really no claim that there are projects in the pipeline, whether they be public or the TIF eligible expenses in private development. That is no longer the case for Clark Street. If this plan is adopted, the communities that share Clark Street have a plan, which puts the community in a very strategic position to make a case for even extending the TIF so that you're not obligated to try to spend whatever is left in the little time that remains. So there's a lot of public improvements that we have seen recommended in this plan, and it's going to take public dollars to execute them. So I would just say that we plan to execute. If you're going to plan to execute, if you're going to make a case that there are TIF dollars needed here, you have to have a plan. So that's really what this process has been about. 18 months ago, there was no plan for Clark Street. Today, there is. And so it's all about strategic strategy on the part of those who want to see improvements on Clark Street. And I'll just leave it at that. I mean, I know because I'm a part of that group that has to go and make the case for why we want to spend public dollars to improve Clark Street. And the question I always get, hey, planning commissioner, where's the plan? We don't know what you want to spend money on. Well, you'll no longer be able to say that about Clark Street. So if you want to think about like, how do you make the case, your participation, your set of recommendations are helping to make the case for that TIF district.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Well said. So at this point, we are a couple minutes after 6. So we want to be respectful of everyone's time, and we can come to a close at this point. Just a reminder, please visit clarkstreetcrossroads.com. That is where you can look at the draft, you can fill out the survey. We're really looking forward to hearing from you by February 12th, after which we will hopefully be able to get this adopted at Plan Commission in March. So thank you again for your time. We really appreciate not just tonight, but throughout this whole past year plus involvement in this process and support to get this over the finish line. Have a lovely evening, everybody.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thanks, Catherine, Commissioner, and Alderman Kappelman, too.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you all.